Have you ever truly considered what legacy means? Is it found in the monuments we build, the empires we forge, or the stories that are told about us long after we're gone? And what happens when the one person given everything, power, wealth, a wisdom so profound it was said to be a gift from the divine, becomes the architect of his own downfall, not at the hands of an invading army, but because of a quiet hairline fracture deep within his own heart? The story we are about to journey through today is one such tale. It is the chronicle of the greatest king his world had ever known, and his tragic, silent collapse. But I promise you, the end of this story is not what you think. It is not a conclusion written in ash and blood. It is something else entirely, something warmer, something unexpected, a lesson learned in the 11th hour. So, perhaps pour yourself a cup of tea or your favorite evening drink and find a comfortable corner in your world. And before we turn that first heavy page of this forgotten history, I'd love to know, where in the world are you joining us from, and what time is it for you? Leave a comment below. I truly love to see how far our stories travel, connecting us all across the time zones. And now, let us begin. Our story opens in Ethelgard, the Kingdom of Light, a realm whose prosperity was not measured in gold, but in luminite, a wondrous stone mined from the northern mountains that pulsed with a soft, ethereal glow. For 40 years, under the reign of Valerius the Great, Ethelgard had transformed from a warring confederation of tribes into a formidable power. King Valerius, a man who possessed the heart of a lion and the cunning of an old wolf, had built this kingdom with his own blood, sweat, and an unyielding will. But now the lion was dying. In the vast royal bedchamber, the cloying scent of medicinal herbs and the stale air of decay hung heavy. The great king, a man whose frown once sent shudders through his generals, now lay still upon his magnificent bed, his body a withered shadow of its former glory. His skin was a roadmap of a life lived hard, etched with the memory of 1,000 battles and 1,000,000 sleepless nights spent worrying over his kingdom. His eyes, once twin suns of fiery command, were now shuttered, clouded with the weariness of a long journey's end. His silence was a palpable weight, no longer the silence of authority, but of surrender. But outside the ornate, carved oaken doors of that chamber, the atmosphere was not one of grief. It was one of anticipation. It was the whisper of sharpening claws. The palace corridors, which once echoed with the king's decisive commands, had become a stage for hurried footsteps and calculated glances. The vultures were circling, and they were not waiting for the lion to draw his final breath. They were waiting for the feast that would follow. Leading this circling flock was the crown prince, Vorlog. He was a perfect echo of his father's youth, but only in the physical sense. Vorlog was a mountain of a man, his muscles straining against the fine fabric of his tunic, his thick black beard making him appear all the more ferocious. He stalked the halls of the palace with an unhidden entitlement, his hand perpetually resting on the pommel of his greatsword, as if the throne were already his. In Vorlog's eyes, Ethelgard was forged by strength, and only strength could sustain it. He held a deep-seated contempt for his younger brother, Kalin, a boy who, in Vorlog's opinion, was good for nothing more than smudging parchment with ink and chipping away at blocks of clay. "This kingdom needs a sword, not a paintbrush," Vorlog would often sneer to his cronies. Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, in a sun-drenched workshop, Prince Kalin existed in another world entirely. His chambers did not smell of power and politics, but of pine wood, damp clay, and fresh ink. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that streamed through the high windows, settling on intricate architectural models, half-finished sculptures, and scrolls unfurled to reveal complex schematics. Kalin did not have the build of a warrior. He was slender, with deep-set, thoughtful eyes that held a touch of melancholy, and his hands, though elegant, were calloused. calloused by the chisel and the brush, not the sword. He loved the kingdom just as fiercely as his brother, but he saw it through different eyes. He didn't see fortresses and garrisons. He saw bridges connecting divided communities, temples where souls could find solace, public squares where children could play freely. He was an artist, an architect, a sensitive soul born into a world of intrigue and iron. The conflict between the two brothers was more than a clash of personalities. It was a collision of philosophies, two divergent visions for the future of Ethelgard. On one side stood raw, physical power, the tradition of the sword, the belief in dominance. On the other, the creative intellect, the aspiration for a kingdom defined by beauty and harmony. The entire court, from the grizzled old generals to the ambitious young courtiers, watched with bated breath. They were all placing their bets. And in that tense, waiting air, a single question hung in every mind. Who would succeed the Lion of Ethelgard? Would it be the sword of Vorlog or the brush of Kalin that would shape the next chapter of this great kingdom? The storm was on the horizon, and the whole realm was listening for the first clap of thunder. The Game of Thrones had begun, and the opening move, a gambit of brazen arrogance and shrewd calculation, was made by Prince Vorlog. He knew the throne would not simply fall into his lap. It had to be seized, not just with might, but with the perceived consent of the military and the nobility. To this end, he announced the Hunt of the Falling Leaf, a traditional autumn event that he intended to twist into an unprecedented display of his own power. The fattest boars were hunted, the finest casks of wine were broached, hundreds of torches were lit, transforming the royal woods into a fiery, open-air court. Vorlog invited every influential general, every wealthy southern lord, and every sycophantic courtier eager to align with the rising sun. In truth, it was a coronation before the fact, a non-verbal declaration that he, Vorlog, was the heir apparent. But within that long, carefully curated guest list, certain names were conspicuously absent. The old guard, the counselors who had ridden into battle with King Valerius and who valued his legacy over his son's brute strength, the high priests of the Temple of Light, who valued humility over ostentation, and of course, Lysandra, the shrewd royal advisor, Kalin's unofficial mentor. Vorlog knew these people would never support him. Their exclusion from the feast was a clear message. Their time was over. In her quiet study, Lysandra showed no sign of alarm when the news of Vorlog's grand hunt reached her. She was a woman in her 50s, her silver hair coiled in an immaculate bun, her eyes possessing a disconcerting stillness. She had served this kingdom long enough to understand that the loudest storms often rise from the quietest places. She saw in Kalin not the makings of a warrior king, but of a builder, a unifier, someone who could give Ethelgard a legacy far greater than conquest. She knew that if Vorlog took the throne, the kingdom was destined for an age of conflict and oppression. Lysandra did not run to Kalin with the news. The artistic prince would only panic, nor did she try to rally the old guard in protest. A futile gesture. Instead, she did something utterly unexpected. She sought out Kalin's mother, Queen Ilara, a gentlewoman who had always remained above the fray of court politics. When Lysandra entered the queen's chambers, Ilara was by the window, her gaze fixed anxiously on the distant woods where the horns of the hunt were blowing. Lysandra bowed, her voice calm as a forest pool when she spoke. "My queen, the wolf howls to frighten the forest. But true power is not found in the loudest roar, but in the undercurrent that can erode a mountain." Ilara turned, her face a mask of confusion. "What do you mean, Lysandra? What can I do?" "Vorlog will seize the throne." A faint, cryptic smile touched Lysandra's lips. "We will not meet him on his battlefield. We will make a whispered gambit. My queen, you will go to the king, but you will not plead for Kalin. You will not weep or speak of Vorlog's plotting. Such things only weary a dying lion." "Then what shall I say?" "You will speak of legacy," Lysandra answered, her voice like a strategist mapping a campaign. "You will remind the king of the dream he had when he first built this kingdom. Not the dream of conquest, but of a shining Ethelgard, a realm of creativity, a place where his children's children could live, in peace and beauty. You will tell him of Kaelin's designs, of the temple your son wishes to build in his father's honor. You will awaken the artist within the warrior. Power is not given to the one who shouts the loudest, but to the one who knows when to be silent and when to speak the one fatal word. And your words, my queen, will be fatal to this ambition." Queen Alara, after a moment of stunned silence, understood. A resolve she never knew she possessed hardened her gentle eyes. The plan was set. A subtle maneuver, fought not with swords but with memory, love, and dreams. While Vorlog feasted and reveled in his imagined victory, a quiet battle, a war of shadows, was silently being waged within the still walls of the palace. And then the decisive moment arrived, announced not by the clash of steel, but by the soft rustle of Queen Alara's gown against the marble floor. She entered the king's chamber, carrying with her the quietude of dusk and the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders. King Valerius's eyelids fluttered open, his dim gaze settling on his wife's face. "You have come, Alara," he rasped, his voice a fragile thread. The queen knelt by his bed, taking his gnarled hand in hers. She did not weep. She offered him a sad, warm smile. "I have come to tell you a story, my love," she said, her voice a gentle balm. "A story of your dream. Do you remember, Valerius? When we first came to this land, you told me you didn't want to build just a fortress. You wanted to build a home for all our people, where the light of the luminite stones would illuminate not just palace corridors, but village streets, a place where songs would be sung instead of battle cries." The king was silent, but a flicker of recognition sparked in his tired eyes. The memories were stirring. Alara continued, her voice flowing like a soft stream. "You fought your whole life to bring peace, Valerius. Your legacy is not the lands you conquered, but the foundation you laid. And I wonder who will build upon that foundation. One who knows only how to wield a hammer to destroy, or one who knows how to use a chisel to create something that will last forever." At that precise moment, as Lysandra had orchestrated, the chamber door opened softly. Kaelin entered, followed by his advisor. He was not dressed in royal finery, but in the simple linen tunic of a craftsman. In his hands he carried a large scroll of parchment. He moved silently to the bedside, knelt beside his mother, and slowly, reverently, unrolled the scroll before his father. On the parchment, rendered in exquisite, painstaking detail, was the design for a magnificent temple. It was a breathtaking work of architecture, with spires that reached for the heavens like praying hands, and a great central dome made of polished luminite that promised to shine even in the darkest night. At the heart of the design was a colossal statue, not of some distant god, but of King Valerius the Great himself, seated on his throne, holding not a sword but a book, a symbol of wisdom and law. What is this?" King Valerius whispered, his eyes locked on the drawing. Kaelin looked up, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears, but his voice was steady. "It is the Temple of Legacy, Father. I want to build it in your honor, so that all the generations of Ethelgard to come will know that this kingdom was built not only with steel, but with a grand vision." In that moment, something shifted in the room. The old warrior king, the man who had lived his life on horseback, seemed to see into the future. He did not see Kaelin's fragility. He saw the continuation of a dream he himself had long since forgotten. He saw immortality. With a final Herculean effort, Valerius pushed himself up, his trembling hand pointing directly at Kaelin. He looked at Lysandra and the old counselors who had now gathered at the door, and with the last of his strength, he issued his final thunderous command, a voice echoing from the past. "Make Kaelin king, now, In the royal woods, Vorlog raised a drinking horn high, his booming laugh echoing through the trees. "A toast," he roared, "to the future of Ethelgard, a strong Ethelgard." But just then another sound carried from the capital, cutting through the revelry. It was the sound of the coronation horn, long, clear, and majestic, once, twice, a third time. The music at Vorlog's feast sputtered and died. His laughter caught in his throat. Every head turned towards the city. Vorlog stood frozen, the horn slipping from his grasp to shatter on the ground. His face was a canvas of disbelief, then confusion, then a deep, burning humiliation. He had lost, not on a battlefield, but in a silent war he never even knew was being fought. The crown had not gone to the strongest, but to the most unexpected. Wisdom and love had won the day, at least for now. Crowned in a flurry of disbelief and quiet triumph, Cailan, guided by the steady hand of Lysandra, began the delicate work of securing his rule. He did not resort to the bloody purges of his predecessors. Instead, he wielded his own unique weapon, his vision. He summoned the kingdom's generals and lords, not to the imposing throne room, but to his own workshop. There, surrounded by models and blueprints, he unveiled his plans for a new Ethelgard. Elegant, sturdy bridges to span treacherous gorges, intricate irrigation systems to bring life to barren fields, and above all, the breathtaking design for the Temple of Legacy in his father's honor. Through his sheer passion and an inspiringly detailed vision, Cailan slowly won over the hearts and minds of the men who had once dismissed him. Vorlog, isolated and stripped of his support, was forced to bend the knee to his younger brother. He was given command of the military garrisons, a position of power that kept his pride intact, but his ambitions in check, leaving him to nurse his resentment in the shadows. And so the golden age of Ethelgard began. Under Cailan's reign, the kingdom did not expand its borders through war, it blossomed from within. The capital city was reborn, a symphony of stone and light. Streets were paved with polished luminite, glowing softly at night, making the city seem like a galaxy fallen to earth. Merchants and scholars flocked from distant lands, bringing not just goods but new ideas. Ethelgard became a beacon of culture and art, a marvel that drew the envy and admiration of the known world. Cailan was hailed as the Architect King, a monarch who ruled not by fear but by inspiration. Yet there was a harsh truth that the glow of the luminite could not illuminate. Every grand monument, every exquisitely carved stone in the capital was paid for with the sweat and sometimes the blood of the miners in the north. The north was another world. There were no gleaming palaces or sun-drenched plazas here, only stark, gray mountains, wind-whipped valleys, and grimy mining towns. Life was a relentless cycle of hardship. Men spent their days deep in the dark, damp tunnels, chipping away at the rock face by the flickering light of torches, their lungs filled with stone dust. The women stayed above ground, mending clothes, tending to meager gardens, and praying for the safe return of their husbands and sons. Under King Valerius, the burden had been heavy, but under Cailan, with his ceaseless, monumental projects, it became crushing. Production quotas doubled, then tripled. The workdays grew longer. The cave-ins and accidents, once a tragic rarity, became a grimly accepted part of life. In a small mining town called Grimcrag, there was a young engineer named Rorik. He was different. Rorik possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a courageous heart. He was the one who designed new pulley systems and support beams that made the mining slightly more efficient, marginally safer. He was respected. Each evening after a grueling day, Rorik would climb a high ridge overlooking his town and gaze south. On a clear night, he could see a faint, luminous smudge on the horizon. It was the glow of the capital city, a light generated by millions of stones that he and his countrymen had sacrificed their youth to unearth. And as he looked at that distant glow, a complex emotion stirred within him. There was a sliver of pride knowing he was part of building something magnificent, but it was overshadowed by a rising tide of bitterness. The prosperity of the South, the beauty of the capital, it was all built on the backs of the North. They were the foundation, solid and essential, but invisible and forgotten. Rorik began to ask the hard questions. Why did their children wear patched-up clothes, while the children of southern nobles wore silk? Why did they eat hard, black bread, while the king's tables overflowed with delicacies? A new fault line, deeper and more dangerous than Vorlog's jealousy, was forming within the kingdom. It was not a conflict between princes, but between two halves of the same body. A conflict between luxury and labor, between the beneficiary and the sacrificed. Kalin, the artist king, in his passionate quest to sculpt beauty, had tragically overlooked the cost of his materials. The foundation of his glorious Ethelgard was beginning to crack, not from an external threat, but from the immense weight of the very wonders it was forced to support. The glory of a king is often measured by the monuments he leaves behind, but there are invisible burdens that no monument can represent. The weight of a crown is not in its gold and jewels, but in the sleepless nights, the agonizing decisions, and the profound isolation at the pinnacle of power. For Kalin, that weight was compounded, for he was not just a king, but an artist, a husband, and a father. In the early years of his reign, Kalin had an anchor, an endless well of inspiration, his beloved wife, Queen Lyra. She was more than just a beautiful queen. She was the sole confidant who understood the artist's soul that resided within the king. She was the first to see his blueprints, the one who walked with him in the royal gardens at twilight, listening to his boldest ideas. She was the one who gently reminded him that, amidst the crushing duties of state, he still needed to breathe, to sketch, to be himself. Together they had a son, Prince Theron, a bright and spirited boy. Kalin's life, though demanding, was a tapestry woven with threads of love and happiness. Then tragedy struck. A sudden, virulent fever stole Queen Lyra from him. Her death was a clean, brutal cut to the heart of Kalin's world, leaving a wound that would never truly heal. The palace, once filled with her laughter, fell into a somber silence. The kingdom mourned their kind queen, but no one could fathom the depth of Kalin's grief. It was a silent, cavernous emptiness that no architectural marvel could ever hope to fill. And from that grief, Kalin's own decline began. He threw himself into his work with a desperate, frantic energy, using it as an anesthetic for his soul. New designs were churned out at a dizzying pace. New projects rose from the ground like a forest of stone and light. The Temple of Legacy was completed in record time. The kingdom marveled at the king's incredible resolve, hailing him as a monarch of unparalleled dedication. But they couldn't see that behind the dedication was a spirit in the throes of exhaustion. Kalin was burning out. The immense pressure to always be strong, to always be the wise king, to carry an entire nation on his shoulders, now compounded by his devastating loss, finally began to suffocate the artist within him. The joy of creation vanished. Work became a mere obligation, a way to keep his mind too occupied to remember Lyra. He began to change. The once approachable king who listened intently became distant and cold. He no longer strolled through the gardens or shared wine with his old counselors. He barricaded himself in his workshop, a fortress of blueprints and models. Lysandra tried time and again to reach him, to urge him to rest, but he would wave her away impatiently. "There is no time, Lysandra," he'd say, his eyes never leaving the scroll before him. Ethelgard must be greater. The person who felt this change most acutely was young Prince Theron. He had lost his mother, and now it felt as though he were losing his father too. Kalin no longer played with him, no longer told him stories of the constellations. He would ask perfunctorily about the prince's studies, and then retreat back into the world of his work. Theron grew up in a gilded cage of loneliness, overshadowed by a father who was both a legend and a stranger. He craved his father's attention, his approval, his love, but all he received was a preoccupied silence. Kaelin's heart, the heart of an artist, was slowly turning to stone. He was building magnificent edifices to mask the hollowness within. He wore the mantle of a great king to hide the fragility of a broken man. His kingdom grew ever more beautiful, but he himself grew ever more faded. The weight of the crown had become a glacier, slowly freezing his soul. And no one, least of all himself, realized that the greatest architect in the world was meticulously constructing the prison of his own spirit. While King Kaelin was entombed in his private grief and isolation, the fracture in the kingdom's foundation was widening into a chasm. In the north, the people's patience had worn thin. Murmurs of discontent had grown into open voices of protest, and the man at the center of this rising storm was Rorik. Rorik was no warmonger. He was an engineer, a man who believed in logic and justice. He had seen too many needless deaths in the mines, too many families struggling in poverty. He believed the people of the North deserved a fairer share. At first, he pursued a path of peace. He gathered the region's elders, and together they drafted a petition to the capital. The language was respectful, not inflammatory. It simply laid out the harsh realities of their lives, the dangers they faced, and humbly requested that the king consider easing the burden of taxes and production quotas. They had faith that their wise and benevolent king would understand. The petition was sent. A week passed, then a month. No reply. They sent a second petition, this one more urgent. Still only a deafening silence from the capital. They could not know that their heartfelt letters never reached the king's desk. They were intercepted by lower-level bureaucrats who deemed them mere complaints, not worthy of troubling the great king who was busy with his monumental works. Or worse, the officials deliberately hid the letters to conceal their own mismanagement of the northern territories. The king's silence was interpreted by the northerners as indifference, as contempt. The embers of resentment burst into flames of anger. Rorik, the pragmatist, was transformed into the leader of the resistance. He organized strikes. Thousands of miners laid down their tools in unison. The flow of luminite to the capital was abruptly choked off. It was an unprecedented act of defiance, a direct challenge to the authority of the throne. News of the strikes finally broke through the walls of Kaelin's solitude. But the king, now so weary and emotionally calloused, was no longer capable of nuanced judgment. He saw the strikes not as a cry for help, but as an infuriating disruption, an obstacle to his grand projects. He dismissed Lysandra's advice to travel north himself and open a dialogue. Instead, he made a decision he would come to regret for the rest of his days. He dispatched Vorlog, his bitter and resentful brother, with a small contingent of the royal guard to pacify the situation. Vorlog arrived in the north not to negotiate, but to unleash his pent-up fury. He used the royal guard to brutally suppress the striking miners. He had Rorik and the other leaders arrested and publicly flogged. He used violence and intimidation to force the miners back into the tunnels. This act of brutality was the final fatal spark. It transformed an economic grievance into a deep-seated ethnic hatred. The people of the North no longer saw the capital as a demanding master. They saw it as the enemy. Rorik, though imprisoned, became a martyr and a symbol. The resistance went underground. Small acts of sabotage began. Mine cart tracks were torn up. Food stores for the southern garrisons were set ablaze. The fracture between the two regions had now become a blood feud. The kingdom of Ethelgard, built on the premise of unity, was teetering on the precipice of civil war, and its king, the architect of its beauty, had remained blind to the rot in his own foundation until it was about to bring the entire structure crashing down. Death came for Kaelin quietly, just as he had lived his final years. He was found in Sharmana's workshop, slumped over an unfinished blueprint, succumbing not to a blade or poison, but to the simple, crushing weight of his own exhaustion and sorrow. The kingdom was plunged into mourning. The people wept for the great king who had made Ethelgard a wonder of the world. But they did not know that the true legacy he left behind was not his architecture, but a kingdom on the brink of self-destruction. And the man who inherited this fractured crown, Prince Theron, stepped onto the throne in the worst possible circumstances. Theron was a young man plagued by the insecurities of a childhood spent in the shadow of a legendary yet absent father. He loved his father but also resented him for his emotional distance. He felt a desperate need to prove himself, to be stronger, more decisive than the artist king had been. He would not be perceived as weak, and this obsession would prove to be his undoing. Hearing of the king's death, the people of the north, now led by a recently freed Rorik, saw a window of opportunity. They did not want rebellion for its own sake. They wanted justice. A delegation consisting of Rorik and the most respected northern elders journeyed to the capital to meet the new king. This time there would be no ignored petitions. They would speak face to face. They were ushered into the great throne room, a magnificent hall that their own sweat had helped to build. Theron sat on the throne trying to project an aura of command, but his nervous eyes betrayed him. He was flanked by his coterie of young, arrogant nobles, his childhood friends who knew only of hunting and courtly pleasures and who constantly whispered poison in his ear about showing strength and asserting royal authority. Rorik stepped forward. His voice was steady and clear, without a trace of fear. "Your Majesty, King Theron, we come not with swords, but with a plea. We have served this kingdom with our very lives, but the yoke upon our shoulders has become unbearable. Your father, Kaelin the Great, built a glorious Ethelgard. We ask only that you allow the foundations of that glory to breathe. Grant the people of the north relief from the crushing taxes and labors, and we swear our loyalty to you until our last breath." It was a reasonable plea, a golden opportunity for Theron to heal the realm. The older, wiser counselors in the back of the room nodded in approval, praying the young king would make the right choice. But Theron didn't listen to them. He listened to the whispers of his friends at his side. "Don't look weak. They're testing you. Show them who's king." The fear of being seen as a lesser man than his father overwhelmed his reason. He took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and spoke the words that would be forever remembered as the fool's decree. "You dare come here to bargain with me?" Theron's voice was high and strained, an adolescent's failed attempt at his grandfather's commanding tone. "You complain of your burden. Let me tell you something. My father, with his soft artist's heart, may have disciplined you with whips, but I am not my father." He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at Rorik and the northern delegation, his voice cracking with misplaced rage. "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Your burden will not be lightened. It will be doubled. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions to teach you the meaning of obedience." A stunned, deathly silence fell over the throne room. The old counselors went pale. Theron's friends smirked in triumph. The northern delegation stood frozen, their faces transforming from hope to shock, then to a cold, hard fury. Rorik said nothing more. He simply held Theron's gaze, a look of profound contempt and pity in his eyes. Then he turned and, with the other elders, walked silently out of the room. There were no arguments, no threats, just a silence more damning than any shout. Just before he passed through the great doors, Rorik paused, looked back one last time at the boy on the throne, and said one sentence loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Then it is done." And in that moment, the kingdom of Ethelgard shattered. Not in a great battle, but with a few foolish words. The last thread of loyalty from the north had been snapped. The last hope for reconciliation was extinguished. Civil war was now inevitable. News of Theron's decree spread like wildfire. The armies of the two regions began to muster, the south with its professional, well-equipped royal guard, the north with greater numbers and the burning ferocity of a people pushed too far. The two forces marched towards each other, their meeting point destined to be the fields of the border river, a flat expanse of land that marked the natural boundary between them. The entire kingdom held its breath, bracing for a cataclysmic brother-against-brother war that would surely destroy everything Valerius and Calen had ever built. But then, something impossible happened, something that would change the course of this history forever. On the night before the fateful battle, a thick fog descended upon the fields, shrouding both camps in a ghostly white veil. In the southern camp, Theron paced his command tent, his earlier arrogance replaced by the gnawing fear of the coming dawn. Suddenly the tent flap was pushed aside and a figure stepped silently inside. Theron, startled, drew his sword, only to freeze in place. The figure before him was not an assassin. It was an old man, cloaked in the simple robes of a pilgrim, his face haggard and lined with sorrow, his hair and beard as white as the fog outside. But his eyes, Theron could never forget those eyes. "Father," he whispered, the sword clattering from his hand. It was Calen. He had not died. Overwhelmed by his grief and failure, he had staged his own death, entrusting the crown to his unprepared son and retreating to a secluded village to live in anonymity, seeking peace for his tormented soul. But when news reached him that his kingdom was about to be consumed by fire, a fire lit by his own mistakes and his son's folly, he knew he could not hide any longer. He had returned, not as a king to reclaim his throne, but as a father, as a teacher, to atone for his sins. Calen stepped forward and embraced his trembling son. "I am here, Theron," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I failed you. I was so lost in my own pain that I forgot you needed a father. But this is no time for regrets. Listen to me now. The true strength of a king is not in forcing others to obey. It is in having the courage to admit his father's mistakes and the wisdom not to repeat them." Leaving Theron to his thoughts, Calen walked alone through the misty no-man's land and into the northern camp. The sentries challenged him but fell back in stunned disbelief when he lowered his hood. Word spread like lightning, and Rorik himself came running to meet him. They stood face to face, surrounded by a circle of silent, astonished soldiers. Rorik, who had once admired Calen, now looked at him with a complex mixture of anger and sorrow. "You've returned," Rorik said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Have you come to watch your legacy burn?" Calen did not flinch from the accusation. He met Rorik's gaze with one of profound sincerity. "I have returned because I owe you and your people an apology. I built beautiful palaces, but I let their foundations rot. I was wrong. But Rorik, look around you. You may win this battle tomorrow. You may take the capital, and then what? You will rule a kingdom of ash, a people forever divided by hatred. Is the freedom you seek truly worth that price, or is there another path? A harder path, perhaps, but one that leads to a genuine peace." Calen's words hung in the cold night air, a bell of reason tolling in the fog of war. The great twist of this saga was not a new plot or a supernatural force. It was the return of conscience, the arrival of a wisdom forged in the crucible of pain and failure. The Ghost King had appeared, not to fight, but to teach his final, most important lesson. The sun rose over the fields of the border river, but it did not illuminate the glint of clashing swords or the tragic banners of war. Instead, the two armies stood in silent formation, watching an unprecedented sight. Theron and Rorik, the would-be combatants, were walking toward the ancient stone bridge that spanned the river, the very line that divided their lands. And walking between them was the old, stooped figure of Calen. They met at the center of the bridge. There was no throne, no royal retinue, just 3 men bearing the weight of a nation's future. It was Theron, with a courage he had never known he possessed, who spoke first. He looked at Rorik, not as an enemy, but as an equal, and for the first time in his life, he spoke not from pride, but from humility. "I was wrong. My foolishness almost drove us to a senseless war. I cannot undo what my father did, nor can I take back the words I spoke, but I can choose a new path forward." Rorik, who had prepared himself for a battle to the death, looked from Theron to Kaelin. He saw the sincerity in their eyes. He thought of the wives who would become widows, the children who would become orphans, if this war were fought. He realized that a victory won through violence would be an empty one. "What is this new path?" he asked. It was Kaelin, silent until now, who answered. His voice was no longer that of a king, but of a father speaking to his sons. "This kingdom can no longer be won. The fracture is too deep. To force it back together now would be like gluing a shattered vase. It will never be strong again. But separation does not have to mean enmity. A body has 2 arms. They perform different tasks, yet they serve the same whole. Ethelgard can be the same." And there, on that historic bridge, with Kaelin as their witness, they drafted a treaty. Not a treaty of surrender, but one of mutual recognition and respect. It was called the Treaty of the Two-Headed Eagle. The unified kingdom of Ethelgard was officially dissolved. In its place, 2 new nations were born. The south would remain Ethelgard, ruled by Theron and his line. The north, the land of mountains and miners, would become the independent Republic of Eredor, governed by Rorik and a council of elders. They would no longer be king and subject, but allies, trading partners, 2 nations bound by a shared history and a common desire for peace. The final scene of our story is of Kaelin, standing alone on a high hill, looking down at the valley below. The wind gently stirred his white hair. From his vantage point he could see the flag of Ethelgard and the new flag of Eredor, 2 different banners flying side by side in the breeze, like the 2 wings of a great eagle. Lysandra came to stand quietly beside him. "You did it," she said softly. A serene smile, the first he had worn in years, touched Kaelin's lips. "I failed to keep the kingdom whole, Lysandra, but perhaps I succeeded in teaching them the most important lesson." "And what is that, my lord?" "Peace," Kaelin answered, his eyes fixed on the 2 flags. "An understanding." His legacy was finally written, not in stone monuments, but in a bridge, a treaty, and a lesson paid for by the breaking of his own life. And that is the story of Kaelin, the king who built a golden age and then, in silence, nearly brought it to ruin. But in the end, his greatest legacy was not the temples of stone that would stand for centuries, but a single moment of wisdom that rose from the ashes of his own failure. This story reminds us that sometimes being broken is not the end. Sometimes it is the beginning of a deeper healing, a more honest understanding. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is not to strive for a flawless, unbroken perfection, but to learn to find the beauty and the peace within the pieces. If you, like us, believe in the power of stories, in journeys that explore the complex, beautiful, and messy truths of the human condition, then this is your home. Every story on our channel is an attempt to reach those deeper places within all of us. Become a part of our community, a place for sharing and reflection. By hitting that subscribe button now, we would be honored to have you with us on the adventures to come. Thank you for listening. May your day or your night be a peaceful one.